are truly daunting. Depression historian Robert McIlvaine wrote recently that the current economic meltdown isn't an exact replay of the Great Depression, but it's a pretty good rhyme, quoting Mark Twain. Economists, business leaders, and policymakers have all been ignoring the lessons learned from that 20th century calamity. The question for us, of course, is what lessons do we need to learn? Now, I think that everyone gathered here agrees that the challenges we face are far more profound than the public conversation is allowing. The crisis we face is nothing less than civilizational, calling for deeper engagement than mere policy tinkering or reform around the edges. I think Ryder is right. The economic story into which we've been socialized and around which our culture is organized is deeply flawed. We need a new narrative. Now, for people of faith, this represents what we might call an evangelical opening. Since the triumph of Enlightenment secularism, managerial capitalism has tended to ignore or co-opt the resources offered by our theological and moral traditions. However, today more people are realizing that this crisis demands nothing less than revisiting the foundations of our social vision. So it's no accident that at the same time Grider's book was being published in the U.S., the World Alliance of Reformed Churches gathered in Accra, Ghana, to issue an historic declaration, which of all the many ecclesial statements that abound in bishops' statements, this is one of the most interesting, no matter what tradition you come from. It read in part, "The root causes of massive threats to life are above all the product of an unjust economic system that is defended and protected by political and military might. Economic systems are a matter of life and death. This crisis is directly related to the development of neoliberal economic globalization, an ideology that claims to be without alternative, demanding an endless flow of sacrifices from the poor and from creation. It makes false promises claiming sovereignty over life and demanding total allegiance, which amounts to idolatry." That's not your grandmother's church speaking. "We believe that any economy of the household of life given to us by God's covenant to sustain life is accountable to God. We believe the economy exists to serve the dignity and well-being of people and community within the bounds of the sustainability of creation. We believe that human beings are called to choose God over mammon, and therefore we reject any ideology or economic regime that puts profits before people, does not care for all creation, and privatizes those gifts of God meant for all. We reject any teaching which justifies those who support or fail to resist such an ideology in the name of the gospel." Well, that's pretty good stuff. It's pretty appropriate to a gathering like this. It was uttered in the shadows of the old slave markets in Ghana. Now, it's sadly true, to paraphrase Jesuit John Hoey, that our churches have for too long read the gospel as if we didn't participate in an economy, and we've participated in the economy as if there were no gospel. But this is changing, and increasingly there are people of faith who see economics as, in the words of the Accra document, a confessional issue. In the meantime, of course, another related stream of conscientization has been growing among faith communities in the face of our deepening ecological crisis. While we should certainly admit that our churches are rather late in coming to the party, we should also recognize that environmental concerns have developed more traction in first world communities of faith than any other single social issue over the past 15 years. Who would have thought, for example, that global warming would become a hot-button issue for evangelicals? The literature on the many dimensions of eco-theology has exploded. Ecumenical organizations doing policy, advocacy, and education are proliferating. And perhaps most importantly, countless local congregations are trying to engage issues such as reducing their environmental footprint and participating in local habitat preservation, all to the good. Of course, along with this popularity comes issues of dilution and deception, and we are now awash in the seductive discourse of corporate greenwashing. Our churches too often settle for tokenistic nods to earth spirituality with no real depth of social analysis or political points of engagement. Again, our religious communities do not yet fully recognize how deeply we need to change the story that we are in. The good news, I think, friends, is that people of the book have a lot to bring to the conversation about a new economic and ecological story. Wisdom that is older and wiser than the predatory fantasies of turbo-capitalism. But we ourselves, as animators and organizers, we need to recover that wisdom, which has been so long pushed to the margins of our traditions. Or as Leslie Silko puts it, sacred stories are all we have to fight off illness and death. Now, for the past 15 years, I've been exploring a theology and practices of what I call the biblical vision of Sabbath economics, a project inspired in part by collaboration with the historic Jubilee 2000 campaign. In the spirit of that ongoing project this morning, I want to look at a text from Luke's Gospel, which addresses exactly this gathering's twin concerns about economic justice and ecological sustainability. In order to set these reflections firmly in a real-world context, however, I want to make two conceptual points concerning the roots of our current crisis as we begin our conversation together. Now, I'm going to speak in broad generalizations, but I find these enormously useful as focalizers. The global economic realities we're facing, and with which we're going to be grappling this weekend, are difficult and complex. The problem, however, of overemphasizing this complexity is that we become overwhelmed and disempowered. We're turned into spectators of a cosmic drama that we can neither comprehend nor engage. And that is, in fact, the perception of most folk in church and society, which is why so much economic and ecological pillaging has been continuing politically unchecked. In the midst of current debates, it is easy to lose sight of the forest for the trees. But I think if we are going to try to change the story that we're living in, we're going to need to remind ourselves that there's a time to make complicated things simple, to practice the Quaker discipline of speaking plainly. Now, by that, I do not mean the simplistic and certainly fairy tale versions that we get about the economy and the ecology in the popular media. I mean, rather, that we need to try to find the essence. And I would like to venture that one way to state our dilemma is that what is flawed about the dominant story is that it has slowly but surely transformed economic exchange from something that was supposed to serve social and ecological relationships to something that now demands the sacrifice of those relationships. Capital has replaced community as the center of our story. That's about as simply as I can put it. But it's not a bumper sticker slogan. In fact, this summarizes the conclusions of many thoughtful economic philosophers, two of whom I'll mention here. As you know, modern capitalism achieved hegemony in the 19th century through processes of industrialization and urbanization that resulted in unprecedented social displacement and environmental destruction. One of the many European intellectuals who were trying to understand this brave new